They screamed over the Yalu River, MiG-15s in tight formation, rockets armed. Below, the Sabres roared to intercept. In one instant, tracer lines stabbed the sky. A MiG spun out, flames licking its wing. Another burst of cannon fire, a jet shuddered, then turned, then fell. In the midst of that steel ballet, one pilot stiffened under 6 Gs, gasping for breath, fingers dancing on the throttle. Neither side knew yet. This clash would ripple beyond Korea, remap air power forever. The Soviets had mocked the F-86 as a paper jet, but today, something in the wind would change. The sky would never look the same. The last piston fighters of World War II had ruled the skies with propeller-driven fury. P-51 Mustangs, Spitfires, Focke-Wulfs. Masters of a realm where altitude meant everything, where dogfights unfolded in graceful arcs at 300 miles per hour. Pilots knew their machines like lovers know each other's heartbeat. Every vibration, every sound, every hesitation spoke a language refined over decades of aerial combat. But by 1945, that world was already dying. The Germans had shown the future with their Me-262 jets, screaming across European skies at speeds that made Allied pilots blink in disbelief. The British followed with the Meteor, the Americans with the P-80 Shooting Star. Yet these early jets remained curiosities, temperamental beasts that consumed fuel like drunkards consume whiskey, prone to flameouts and compressor stalls. Most Air Force commanders still believed in the piston engine's reliability, the propeller's proven track record. The doctrine remained rooted in World War II thinking. Fighters cleared the skies, bombers delivered the knockout punch, and air superiority meant controlling the space above the battlefield. Simple, proven, comfortable. Then Korea erupted and comfort became a luxury no one could afford. June 25, 1950. North Korean tanks rolled across the 38th parallel while Soviet-built Il-2 Sturmovix strafed South Korean positions. President Truman committed American forces within days, but the early response revealed a sobering truth. The United States Air Force was still fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's machines. F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets represented America's first-generation jet fighters, fast in level flight, but heavy, sluggish in turns, and carrying the operational limitations that plagued all early jets. Their pilots, many of them World War II veterans, found themselves adapting to machines that responded differently, burned fuel at alarming rates, and demanded new tactical thinking. Initially, it seemed manageable. North Korean pilots flew obsolete aircraft with minimal training. American jets swept them from the sky with methodical efficiency. By autumn 1950, as UN forces pushed toward the Yalu River, many believed air superiority was a settled matter. They were catastrophically wrong. November 1, 1950. Lieutenant Russell Brown, piloting an F-80C, spotted an unfamiliar silhouette approaching from across the Chinese border. Clean lines, swept wings, a profile that didn't match any known North Korean aircraft. The MiG-15 had entered the war. Brown managed to down that first MiG in history's first all-jet combat. But within weeks, the implications became terrifyingly clear. These weren't the improvised, obsolescent aircraft of the North Korean Air Force. These were sophisticated, modern fighters flown by pilots who understood their machines and possessed tactical knowledge that suggested extensive training. Training that seemed suspiciously advanced for newly converted Chinese or North Korean aviators. The MiG-15 climbed faster, turned tighter at high altitude, and carried cannons that could destroy any UN aircraft with a single well-placed burst. Worse, they appeared in ever-increasing numbers, flown with coordination and discipline that spoke of experienced hands on the controls. Soviet propaganda machinery seized upon the F-86 Sabre's delayed arrival in Korea and its initial production problems to craft a narrative of American weakness. Pravda's headlines mocked the paper jet of capitalist industry, a fighter so poorly designed it couldn't even reach the battlefield on schedule. Radio Moscow broadcast claims that American pilots feared to engage the superior MiG-15, that the vaunted Sabre was nothing more than publicity and empty promises. The mockery had teeth because it contained elements of truth. The F-86A had indeed suffered production delays. Early models showed troubling tendencies toward compressor stalls, their engines requiring careful handling that limited combat effectiveness. The first Sabres to reach the Far East needed extensive modifications before they could operate effectively in Korea's harsh conditions. Colonel Ivan Kozhedub, the Soviet Union's leading World War II ace and a man intimately familiar with the MiG-15's capabilities, reportedly dismissed the Sabre as an overweight advertisement for American marketing. The communist press picked up such sentiments, amplifying them into a chorus of derision that painted the coming air battle as a mismatch between superior socialist engineering and inferior capitalist compromise. Soviet confidence ran deeper than propaganda, however. The MiG-15 represented genuine achievement, a clean-sheet design that incorporated German research, British jet engine technology, and Soviet manufacturing capability. Its VK-1 engine, derived from the Rolls-Royce Nene, provided exceptional power. Its swept wings, informed by German wartime research, allowed high-speed performance that exceeded most contemporary fighters. Its 37mm and 23mm cannons could destroy any aircraft with a single burst. Most importantly, the pilots flying these MiGs weren't inexperienced Chinese or North Korean aviators still learning jet operations. Many were Soviet Air Force veterans, flying volunteer missions while maintaining the fiction of Chinese involvement. Men like Nikolai Sutyagin and Sergei Kramarenko brought years of combat experience and intensive jet training to Korean skies. Captain James Jabara adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the instrument panel of his F-86A. The engine's whine filled the cockpit, still strange after years of piston engines, but familiar enough now to feel like home. Outside, the Korean landscape rolled away beneath scattered clouds, peaceful from 30,000 feet. Deceptively peaceful. Jabara represented the new breed of jet fighter pilot, a Lebanese-American from Kansas. He'd flown P-51 Mustangs in World War II, accumulating 1.5 aerial victories before the war ended. Now, 5 years later, he faced learning an entirely different kind of aerial combat. The F-86 demanded new techniques, new tactical thinking, and new ways of understanding three-dimensional movement at speeds that compressed reaction times into fragments of seconds. His squadron mates shared similar backgrounds. Men like George Davis, Walker Mahurin, and Frederick Bless, pilots who'd cut their teeth on propeller-driven fighters and now found themselves adapting to jets that could climb at rates their old Mustangs reached in level flight, that could turn fights from pursuit curves to energy management problems, that made altitude and airspeed relationships more critical than ever before. Across the Yalu, Soviet pilots faced their own adaptations. Major Nikolai Sutyagin had flown Leg-3s and Yak-9s against the Luftwaffe, learning aerial combat in the cauldron of the Eastern Front. But the MiG-15 demanded different skills. Its performance envelope was broader but less forgiving. Its armament was devastatingly effective, but required precise gunnery. Its handling characteristics rewarded smooth control inputs and punished ham-fisted corrections. Captain Sergei Kramarenko, another veteran of the Great Patriotic War, found himself commanding flights of MiG-15s while maintaining the elaborate fiction that he was a Chinese volunteer. The Soviet Union's involvement in Korea remained officially non-existent, forcing experienced pilots to fly in unmarked aircraft while speaking Russian over their radios only when certain no American intelligence aircraft were listening. These men brought professional competence to their machines, but they also carried human frailties. Jabara wrote letters to his wife about the weight of responsibility, about leading younger pilots into combat against an enemy whose capabilities were still being discovered. Sutyagin's diary, discovered decades later in Russian archives, revealed similar concerns, the pressure of maintaining tactical superiority while operating under political constraints that limited engagement options. Both sides understood that individual skill would matter, but increasingly, the machines themselves would prove decisive. The F-86 and MiG-15 represented different philosophies of fighter design. The Sabre emphasized pilot workload reduction, superior gun sight technology, and balanced performance across multiple flight regimes. The MiG prioritized raw performance, climb rate, ceiling, and firepower, while demanding more from its pilot. The stage was set. Two different approaches to jet fighter design, flown by experienced pilots representing opposing worldviews, would meet in the skies over Northwest Korea. The area would soon earn a name that captured its lethal significance, MiG Alley. December 17, 1950. The 4th Fighter Group's F-86As crossed into North Korean airspace for the first time, their pilots alert for the MiG-15s that had been savaging UN bomber formations. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton led the formation, his eyes scanning the sky ahead while his radio crackled with position reports. At 25,000 feet, they found them. 4 MiG-15s in loose formation, silver shapes against the winter sky. Hinton called the attack, and the Sabres rolled into their first high-speed encounter with the Soviet Union's premier fighter. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 minutes, an eternity in jet combat, a heartbeat in human terms. The MiGs initially held altitude advantage, diving toward the Sabres with cannon blazing. But something unexpected happened. The F-86s didn't break and run as F-80s and F-84s had been forced to do. Instead, they stayed in the fight, matching the MiGs turn for turn, their pilots discovering that their mounts could dance at altitudes where the Soviet fighters had previously reigned supreme. Hinton's gun sight tracked a MiG through a climbing turn. The F-86's 650 caliber machine guns stuttered, tracers reaching across the sky. The MiG rolled, dove, tried to extend, but the Sabre stayed with it. More bursts, pieces flying from the Soviet fighter's wing. Suddenly the MiG snap-rolled and dove vertically, streaming fuel. Hinton had scored the F-86's first aerial victory. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical significance. For the first time since November, UN pilots had engaged MiGs on equal terms and emerged victorious. The paper jet had drawn first blood, but the MiGs drew blood too. Over the following weeks, as both sides escalated their presence over Northwest Korea, losses mounted on both sides. The air battles revealed that neither fighter held decisive advantages across all flight regimes. The MiG climbed faster and fought better at extreme altitudes. The Sabre turned more tightly at medium altitudes and could outdive its opponent. More critically, both aircraft exposed their pilots to lethal risks. MiG cannons could destroy a Sabre with a single burst, but required precise gunnery at high closing speeds. Sabre machine guns demanded longer firing passes, but proved more forgiving of minor aiming errors. MiG pilots learned to avoid turning fights where the F-86's superior roll rate gave American pilots advantages. Sabre pilots discovered they couldn't climb with MiGs, but could force diving engagements where their superior high-speed handling paid dividends. By early 1951, the air war had settled into patterns that would define the next 2 years of conflict. MiGs held the high ground, using their climb rate and ceiling advantages to position for attacks on UN bomber formations. Sabres provided escort, trying to prevent those attacks while looking for opportunities to force the MiGs into disadvantageous fight conditions. Neither side had achieved the decisive advantages their propaganda claimed. The paper jet had proven it could fight, but the MiG-15 remained a formidable opponent in experienced hands. The real battle was just beginning. February 1951. Captain Jabara pulls his F-86A into a climbing turn, G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. 2,000 feet above, a flight of MiG-15s circles like silver sharks, their pilots waiting for the perfect moment to dive. The altimeter reads 35,000 feet. Thin air where jet engines gulp for oxygen and human reflexes slow under physiological stress. Bandits high, 2 o'clock, his wingman calls over the radio. Jabara sees them now, 4 MiGs in loose deuce formation, their Soviet pilots maintaining altitude advantage while studying the Sabres below. This is the deadly choreography that's emerging over Northwest Korea. MiGs hold the high ground, Sabres try to force them down. Both sides probe for weakness while avoiding decisive engagement unless conditions favor them. The MiGs begin their descent, picking up speed for a high-speed pass. Jabara calls for his flight to turn into the attack, using the F-86's superior roll rate to position for a head-on engagement. Closing speed approaches 1,200 miles per hour, faster than sound, faster than human reflexes were evolved to handle. In the space of a heartbeat, aircraft flash past each other, cannon and machine gun fire stitching the air. A MiG pulls up hard, its pilot hauling back on the stick to convert speed into altitude. The maneuver, called a zoom climb, exploits the Soviet fighter's superior power-to-weight ratio. But Jabara has learned to read these fights differently now. Instead of following the MiG up where his Sabre would stall first, he rolls inverted and dives, trading altitude for speed while positioning for another attack. This is the new mathematics of jet combat. Energy management replaces the turning dogfights of the propeller era. Altitude equals potential energy. Speed equals kinetic energy. The pilot who manages both most efficiently wins the fight. The MiG-15's advantages lie in its ability to climb quickly and fight at extreme altitudes. The F-86's strengths emerge in diving attacks and sustained turning combat at medium altitudes. But understanding these principles and applying them under combat stress are different matters entirely. Lieutenant Jacob Kratt, flying wing position in Jabara's flight, finds himself separated from his leader during the engagement. Above him, a MiG-15 rolls inverted and dives, its pilot lining up for a deflection shot. Kratt's training kicks in. Break turn, spoil the enemy's tracking solution. Try to reverse positions. But the MiG pilot is experienced too. He leads his target perfectly, his 37mm cannon sending a single round through the F-86's engine bay. The Sabre shudders, engine fire warning lights illuminating Kratt's instrument panel. He has perhaps seconds before the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. His hands move without conscious thought. Throttle to idle, fuel shut off, electrical power to emergency. Below, the Korean landscape rises to meet him as he points the dying fighter toward friendly territory. At 5,000 feet, he pulls the ejection seat handle. The parachute opens with a shock that rattles his teeth. Below, his F-86 impacts a hillside and explodes, adding another aircraft to the war's mounting toll. Kratt will survive, rescued by UN forces after a cold night hiding in Korean mountains. His Sabre represents one lesson in the deadly education both sides are receiving about jet combat. Tech Sergeant Bill Maxim wipes his hands on an oily rag and surveys the flight line at Kimpo Air Base. Dawn is still 2 hours away, but the maintenance crews are already preparing F-86s for the day's missions. Each aircraft represents thousands of man-hours, engine changes, battle damage repairs, system upgrades, and the endless minor adjustments that keep complex machines functioning in harsh conditions. The Sabre beside him shows fresh patches over machine gun holes, reminders of yesterday's engagement over the Yalu. The pilot, a 23-year-old first lieutenant from Oregon, had limped home with a damaged hydraulic system and fuel streaming from punctured wing tanks. Close enough to enemy fire to smell the cordite. Close enough to death to count the extra heartbeats. Maxim has been working on fighters since 1943, when he maintained P-47 Thunderbolts in England. He understands aircraft, knows how they sound when everything's working properly, can diagnose problems by the way an engine coughs or a control surface responds. But these jets are different. More complex, more sensitive to maintenance quality, less forgiving of shortcuts or approximations. The F-86A's J-47 engine requires careful attention to fuel control settings, compressor blade clearances, and turbine temperature limits. Operating at altitudes where temperatures drop to 40 degrees below zero, then diving into warmer air where thermal shock stresses every component, the engines face conditions that push engineering tolerances to their limits. Maxim and his crew work through Korean winters that freeze lubricant solid, through summers where heat shimmers rise from metal surfaces hot enough to burn human skin. Each returning pilot brings stories that add to the maintenance crew's understanding of combat damage. Machine gun bullets that sever control cables, cannon shells that fragment against armor plating, G-forces that stress airframes beyond design limits, battle damage that reveals which systems are truly essential and which are merely convenient. Captain Howard Lane climbs down from his F-86's cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the freezing Korean morning. His hands shake slightly, after effects of combat stress and high G-forces that pressed him to the edge of consciousness during a turning fight with two MiG-15s. Lane's been flying fighters for 6 years, but jet combat still surprises him with its intensity and speed. "How'd she handle, sir?" Maxim asks, running his hands over the Sabre's wings to check for unseen damage. "Like a lady," Lane replies, though his voice carries undertones of exhaustion. "Stayed with me through a 6G turn that probably should have torn her wings off." What Lane doesn't mention is the moment during the engagement when his vision grayed out, when the blood drained from his brain under G-forces that human physiology wasn't designed to handle. For perhaps 2 seconds. An eternity in air combat, he flew on, instinct alone while his conscious mind struggled to function. Those seconds could have meant death had the MiG pilot been more aggressive or more accurate. This is the human cost that rarely appears in official reports. Pilots pushing their bodies beyond normal limits, maintenance crews working 18-hour days to keep aircraft mission-capable, ground personnel adapting to equipment and conditions that test both technical knowledge and emotional resilience. Colonel Harrison Thine calls his pilots together in the briefing room at Kimpo. Outside, February wind howls across the Korean landscape, carrying with it the smell of war, cordite, aviation fuel, and the metallic scent of machinery stressed beyond normal limits. Inside, maps cover the walls, showing the deadly geography of MiG Alley, where daily air battles determine the balance of power over Northwest Korea. "Gentlemen," Thing begins, his voice carrying the authority of a pilot who flew P-47s over Europe and now commands F-86s over Korea. "We're learning this business as we go, and the education is costing us aircraft and pilots. Time to apply what we've learned. The lessons are written in loss reports and combat debriefings. MiG-15s hold performance advantages at extreme altitudes, but they're less maneuverable in the dense air below 25,000 feet. Soviet pilots prefer hit-and-run attacks, using their climb rate to engage and disengage at will. But they become vulnerable in sustained turning fights where the F-86's superior roll rate and control harmony allow American pilots to gain positional advantages." Major George Davis, already showing the aggressive instincts that will make him one of the war's leading aces, raises his hand. "Colonel, what about changing our patrol altitudes? Instead of trying to match the MiGs at 40,000 feet, what if we force them to come down to us?" It's a tactical insight that will reshape how Sabres fight MiGs. Rather than climbing to meet Soviet fighters at their preferred altitudes, UN pilots will establish combat air patrols at medium altitudes, where F-86 performance advantages offset MiG climbing ability. The change requires disciplined execution, resisting the natural pilot instinct to climb toward an enemy, but it promises to level the playing field. Captain Manuel Fernandez, a pilot whose analytical mind complements his aggressive flying, contributes another piece to the tactical puzzle. The MiGs break off engagement when they run low on fuel. Their internal fuel capacity limits their combat time over the battle area. If we can extend engagements, force them to burn fuel maneuvering, we might be able to catch them during their withdrawal. These insights, born from combat experience and paid for with damaged aircraft and wounded pilots, begin to coalesce into doctrine. F-86 formations will use disciplined teamwork to force MiGs into disadvantageous fight conditions. Wingmen will maintain position to cover leaders during attacks. Flight leaders will choose engagement conditions that favor Sabre performance while avoiding MiG strengths. But the Soviets are learning too. Major Nikolai Sutyagin, flying his unmarked MiG-15 from bases across the Yalu River, studies engagement reports and adapts his tactics accordingly. If American pilots want to fight at medium altitudes, his MiGs will perfect high-speed, hit-and-run attacks that minimize exposure to F-86 advantages. If Sabres use teamwork to gain tactical advantages, MiG formations will coordinate their attacks to isolate individual American fighters. The result is an escalating cycle of tactical innovation. Each engagement provides data that both sides analyze, leading to refined techniques that must be tested in subsequent combat. Pilots become unwitting participants in a deadly experiment that will determine the future of air warfare. The F-86E arrives at Kimpo Air Base in May 1951, and experienced Sabre pilots immediately notice the differences. The new model incorporates lessons learned from 6 months of combat operations. Its improved flight controls eliminate some of the high-altitude handling quirks that plagued the F-86A. More importantly, its upgraded gunsight system, the A1CM, provides computing power that transforms gunnery from art to science. Lieutenant William Wisner, a World War II ace adapting to jets, climbs into the cockpit of his new F-86E and marvels at the technological sophistication. The computing gunsight automatically adjusts for target range, closing speed, and G-forces, providing a firing solution that removes much of the guesswork from high-speed gunnery. What once required intuitive understanding of deflection angles and lead calculations now becomes a matter of keeping the sight's pipper on target while the computer does the mathematics. But technology alone doesn't guarantee victory. The gunsight is only effective if pilots can position their aircraft for accurate shots, and MiG-15 pilots have learned to avoid prolonged tracking situations where F-86 advantages come into play. The real innovation lies in how American pilots integrate improved technology with evolving tactics. Captain Richard Becker demonstrates the new capabilities during a mission over the Chongchon River. His flight encounters 4 MiG-15s attempting to intercept a formation of B-29 bombers. Instead of climbing to meet the Soviet fighters, Becker positions his Sabres for an intercept at 28,000 feet, forcing the MiGs to dive toward the bomber formation. The lead MiG pilot, intent on reaching the B-29s, doesn't see Becker's approach until tracers flash past his canopy. The American pilot's improved gunsight tracks the target through a high G turn, compensating for deflection and range changes automatically. Multiple hits stitch across the MiG's fuselage, and the Soviet fighter rolls inverted, trailing fuel and coolant. But the engagement also reveals the continuing lethality of MiG armament. Becker's wingman, Lieutenant Robert Wayne, maneuvers to cover his leader's attack when a second MiG appears out of the sun. The Soviet pilot's 37mm cannon fires once, a single round that explodes against the F-86's wing root, severing control cables and hydraulic lines. Wayne's Sabre becomes uncontrollable, forcing him to eject over enemy territory. These are the mixed lessons of technological evolution. Each improvement in aircraft performance or weapon systems creates new tactical possibilities while revealing additional vulnerabilities. The F-86E's better gunsight makes American pilots more lethal in gun tracking situations, but MiG cannons remain capable of destroying any fighter with a single well-placed hit. By summer 1951, the air war over Korea has settled into patterns that define modern jet combat. Large formations of MiG-15s, sometimes numbering 50 or more aircraft, sweep south from their bases across the Yalu River. They're met by smaller formations of F-86s that use superior tactics and pilot training to offset numerical disadvantages. The battles unfold in 3 dimensions across altitudes ranging from ground level to 50,000 feet. MiGs dive from high altitude, attempting to destroy UN bomber formations or fighter bombers attacking North Korean targets. Sabres climb to intercept, trying to force the Soviet fighters into disadvantageous combat conditions. The engagements produce a deadly aerial ballet where split-second decisions determine life and death outcomes. Captain James Lowe leads a flight of 4 F-86s on patrol over Sinwiju, when ground control reports a large formation of MiGs assembling north of the Yalu. Radar plots show at least 30 bandits climbing through 40,000 feet. More MiGs than Lowe's flight can possibly engage directly. But direct engagement isn't the objective. Instead, the 4 Sabres will try to disrupt the Soviet formation, forcing individual MiGs into situations where F-86 advantages can be exploited. Maintain spacing, Lowe radios to his pilots. We'll take the flight leaders and break up their formation. The MiGs come south in a loose stream, their pilots maintaining altitude while searching for targets below. Lowe's flight climbs to 35,000 feet and turns to intercept. setting up for a head-on attack that will force the Soviet fighters to respond. At closing speeds approaching 1,200 miles per hour, reaction time compresses into fractions of seconds. Cannon fire and machine gun tracers fill the air as the formations pass through each other. A MiG pulls up hard, trying to convert speed into altitude for a second attack. But Low has anticipated the maneuver. Instead of following the Soviet fighter up, he rolls inverted and positions for a diving attack on the MiG's wingman. The engagement spreads across 50 miles of Korean sky as individual combats develop from the initial clash. F-86s use their superior diving performance to force fights at medium altitudes. MiGs employ their climb rate to regain energy and position for new attacks. Both sides suffer losses. 2 MiGs destroyed, 1 F-86 damaged and forced to abort. But the pattern favors the Sabres. Soviet formations arrive over their target areas disrupted and low on fuel. F-86 flights remain cohesive, their pilots using disciplined tactics to gain sequential advantages. The cumulative effect, repeated over hundreds of engagements, begins to shift the balance of air superiority. But the Soviets adapt too. Major Sergei Kramarenko, analyzing combat reports from his base in China, identifies American tactical patterns and develops countermeasures. If F-86 pilots prefer diving attacks, MiG formations will include high-cover flights positioned to intercept diving Sabres. If American pilots rely on teamwork, Soviet fighters will coordinate their attacks to isolate individual F-86s from their wingmen. The learning curve runs both directions, each side forcing the other to higher levels of tactical sophistication. By autumn 1951, air battles over Korea represent the most intense aerial combat since World War II, featuring aircraft and tactics that preview the future of air warfare. October 23, 1951. Captain Richard Becker checks his oxygen mask and scans the clear sky above the Yalu River. His F-86E climbs through 30,000 feet, engine humming with the controlled violence that defines jet flight. Behind him, 3 more Sabres maintain loose formation, their pilots alert for the MiG formations that intelligence reports suggest are massing across the Chinese border. Doghouse to Baker flight, the radio crackles. Ground control's voice carries tension despite its professional calm. Large formation of bandits. Angels 4-5, approaching from the northwest. Estimate 50 plus aircraft, 50 MiGs against 4 Sabres. The mathematics of aerial combat don't favor heroics, but mathematics don't account for training, tactics, or the technological advantages that months of combat have revealed. Becker's flight represents the evolution of American fighter tactics. Disciplined teamwork replacing individual heroics. Energy management supplanting turning dogfights. Systematic exploitation of F-86 strengths while avoiding MiG advantages. At 42,000 feet, the MiGs appear as silver specks against the autumn sky, their contrails writing temporary script across the stratosphere. The Soviet formation flies in loose regimental strength. 3 squadrons of fighters arranged in stepped altitude, with experienced pilots leading less experienced Chinese and North Korean aviators. Major Nikolai Sutyagin, flying in the leading element, spots the 4 rising Sabres and makes his tactical decision. With numerical superiority of 12-1, his formation can afford to sacrifice positioning for overwhelming firepower. He signals for a coordinated attack, 36 MiGs diving toward the outnumbered Americans. But Becker has learned the lessons written in loss reports and combat debriefings. Instead of climbing to meet the diving MiGs, he turns his flight perpendicular to their attack, forcing the Soviet pilots to adjust their intercept geometry while bleeding energy in the turn. More critically, he's positioned his Sabres where their superior diving performance can be exploited if the engagement develops favorably. The first MiGs flash past in a high-speed pass, their 23mm and 37mm cannons reaching for the F-86s with brief, lethal bursts. Tracers stitch the air around Becker's aircraft as he rolls inverted and pulls into a split S, trading altitude for airspeed while positioning below the MiG formation. What follows is aerial combat compressed into its most violent essence. Individual engagements develop and resolve in seconds while larger tactical patterns play out across minutes. MiGs attempt to use their numerical advantage to overwhelm the Sabres through coordinated attacks. F-86 pilots employ superior tactics and aircraft handling to avoid disadvantageous combat while creating opportunities to exploit their technological advantages. Lieutenant Jacob Patterson, flying wing position in Becker's flight, finds himself isolated when a group of MiGs coordinates an attack designed to separate him from his leader. 3 Soviet fighters converge on his position, their pilots intending to destroy the lone F-86 through overwhelming firepower. Patterson's training takes over. Instead of attempting to outclimb the MiGs, a futile effort given their performance advantages, he rolls into a diving turn that uses the F-86's superior high-speed handling. The lead MiG pilot follows, but his aircraft becomes less maneuverable as airspeed increases. Patterson reverses his turn, exploiting the Sabre's better roll rate to position behind the Soviet fighter. His improved gun sight tracks the MiG through a high G-turn, automatically computing deflection and range while Patterson concentrates on keeping the target centered. 6 50 caliber machine guns fire in unison, their combined firepower stitching across the MiG's wing route. The Soviet fighter shudders, rolls inverted, and begins a spiral that ends in the mountains below. But the victory costs valuable time and altitude. The remaining 2 MiGs in the attacking element position for deflection shots, their heavier cannons requiring less precise gunnery to achieve lethal results. Patterson breaks hard left, G-forces pressing him to the edge of consciousness as he tries to spoil their tracking solutions. Captain Manuel Fernandez, monitoring the engagement from higher altitude, recognizes his wingman's predicament and dives to assist. His F-86 accelerates through the sound barrier, controls stiffening as compressibility effects grip the aircraft. At 600 miles per hour, he fires a long burst at the trailing MiG, not expecting hits, but intending to disrupt the Soviet pilot's concentration. The psychological effect proves decisive. The MiG pilot, faced with tracers from an unexpected angle, breaks off his attack on Patterson to deal with the new threat. In that moment of divided attention, Patterson reverses his turn again, positioning for a shot at the MiG that had been threatening his 6 o'clock position. The engagement spreads across 30 miles of Korean sky as individual combats develop from the larger battle. At any given moment, a dozen separate dogfights unfold simultaneously, each with its own tactical geometry and lethal possibilities. MiG pilots attempt to coordinate their attacks while conserving fuel for the return to bases across the Yalu. F-86 pilots work to break up Soviet formations while creating opportunities to exploit their aircraft's advantages. The October 23 engagement produces mixed results that nevertheless indicate a fundamental shift in the air war's trajectory. 3 MiGs destroyed against 1 F-86 damaged represents a tactical victory for the outnumbered Sabres. But more importantly, it demonstrates systematic exploitation of technological and tactical advantages that promise strategic implications. Captain Becker's flight returns to Kimpo with gun camera footage that becomes part of the tactical education process. Frame-by-frame analysis reveals how disciplined use of F-86 advantages, superior diving performance, better high-speed handling, and improved gunnery systems can overcome numerical disadvantages when applied systematically. Major Thing reviews the footage with his squadron commanders, identifying tactical principles that can be standardized across the fighter wing. Notice how Becker forces the engagement into diving attacks where our birds have the advantage. Notice how his wingmen maintain mutual support instead of getting separated into individual dogfights. This is how we fight MiGs from now on. The implications extend beyond individual engagements. Soviet commanders, analyzing their own loss reports, recognize that American pilots are no longer simply reacting to MiG tactics, but implementing systematic approaches that exploit F-86 strengths while minimizing exposure to MiG advantages. The paper jet that Soviet propaganda once mocked is proving capable of consistent tactical victories against superior numbers. Major Sutyagin grounded for 3 days following the October 23 battle, while investigators review the engagement, studies intelligence reports about American tactical evolution. The F-86 pilots are learning faster than anticipated, developing techniques that minimize Soviet advantages while maximizing their own capabilities. More concerning, they're doing so systematically, suggesting institutional learning that will be difficult to counter. From his quarters at Antung Airfield, Sutiagan writes in his personal diary, "The Americans are no longer the same pilots who arrived in Korea 6 months ago. Their tactics have evolved beyond simple adaptation. They fight with purpose now, with systematic exploitation of their aircraft's capabilities. We must adapt or face systematic defeat." The Soviet response comes in the form of tactical modifications designed to counter American innovations. MiG formations begin incorporating feints and deception, using small groups of fighters to draw F-86s into predetermined kill zones where larger formations wait in ambush. Soviet pilots receive updated training in energy management, learning to fight F-86s on more equal terms at medium altitudes where previous MiG advantages were less pronounced. But institutional change moves slowly, and individual pilot skill remains the decisive factor in jet combat's unforgiving mathematics. The Americans have advantages beyond their aircraft: better training, superior maintenance, and pilots who can focus entirely on combat effectiveness without political constraints that limit Soviet engagement options. November 30th, 1951. The largest air battle of the Korean War develops from what begins as a routine bomber escort mission. 31 F-86Es climb toward the Yalu River, their mission to provide cover for B-29 superfortresses attacking the Sinuiju airfield complex. Intelligence estimates suggest moderate MiG opposition, perhaps 20 to 30 fighters that can be handled by standard escort tactics. The estimates prove catastrophically wrong. At 35,000 feet, radar operators detect the first wave of MiGs crossing from Chinese airspace. Then a second wave, then a third. Within minutes, the radar scopes show more than 150 Soviet fighters converging on the bomber formation from multiple directions. The largest coordinated air attack since World War II. Colonel Harrison Thing, leading the F-86 formation, faces a tactical nightmare. His 31 fighters must protect the vulnerable B-29s against odds of nearly 5 to 1, while the MiGs hold altitude advantage and the initiative. Standard escort tactics become irrelevant when enemy numerical superiority reaches such overwhelming proportions. All Baker flights, "This is Baker-led," Thing radios. Break up their formations any way you can. Don't let them coordinate their attacks. What follows is aerial combat at its most chaotic and lethal. F-86 flights abandon close escort duties and climb to engage the MiG formations directly, accepting individual risk to prevent coordinated attacks on the bombers. The tactical decision transforms the engagement from an escort mission into a desperate air superiority battle where the stakes include not just individual aircraft, but the entire bomber formation. Major George Davis, flying his F-86E MiG-Mad Marine, leads his flight directly into the largest concentration of Soviet fighters. His attack breaks up a coordinated dive by 12 MiGs, scattering the formation and preventing a massed attack on the B-29s. But the aggressive tactic isolates his flight from mutual support, creating opportunities for other MiG formations to coordinate attacks on his scattered Sabres. Captain James Lowe, flying wing position in Davis's flight, finds himself engaged simultaneously by 4 MiGs, whose pilots coordinate their attacks to eliminate his escape routes. The Soviet fighters attack from different altitudes and aspects, their combined firepower creating a lethal convergence zone that Lowe must somehow avoid while maintaining offensive capability. His F-86 shudders under G-forces as he pulls into a climbing turn, trying to position for a shot at the lead MiG while avoiding cannon fire from the other 3. The improved gun sight tracks the target through the turn, but closing speed and angular rates make accurate gunnery nearly impossible. Lowe fires anyway, hoping to disrupt the Soviet formation's coordination. The burst misses, but achieves its psychological objective. The lead MiG pilot, faced with tracers passing close to his canopy, breaks off his attack to avoid the F-86's fire. The momentary disruption allows Lowe to reverse his turn and dive away from the engagement, trading altitude for airspeed while seeking better tactical positioning. But the dive carries him into the engagement envelope of another MiG formation. Captain Sergei Kramarenko, Leading a flight of 4 experienced Soviet pilots, recognizes the isolated F-86 as an opportunity for a coordinated kill. His fighters position themselves to attack from multiple angles, their combined firepower making evasion nearly impossible. Lowe sees the trap developing and makes a decision that epitomizes the evolved tactics of American fighter pilots. Instead of attempting to escape through evasive maneuvering, he turns directly into the attack, accepting the risk of head-on engagement to deny the MiGs their preferred deflection shots. The opposing fighters close at combined speeds exceeding 1,200 miles per hour. Kramarenko's 37mm cannon fires twice, its shells passing inches from Lowe's canopy as the F-86 pilot holds his course. Lowe's 6 machine guns answer, their combined firepower reaching across the shrinking distance between the aircraft. The engagement lasts perhaps 2 seconds of real time. Both aircraft flash past each other, neither pilot certain of the outcome until systems checks reveal the damage. Lowe's F-86 shows hits in the wing route, but flight controls remain functional. Kramarenko's MiG trails coolant and fuel, forcing him to abort the engagement and return to base. The individual combat typifies the larger battle's character. Neither side achieves decisive advantages, but the cumulative effect of dozens of such engagements gradually shifts tactical balance. MiG formations find their coordinated attacks disrupted by aggressive F-86 tactics. Soviet pilots discover that American fighters no longer avoid engagement, but seek it out under conditions that favor F-86 performance. By the engagement's end, both sides claim victory while acknowledging significant losses. The MiGs prevent effective bombing of their target airfield, but lose 12 aircraft in the process. The F-86s successfully protect most of the B-29 formation, but suffer 6 losses of their own. Unsustainable rates that demonstrate the limitations of fighter escort against overwhelming numerical odds. December 13, 1951. Captain Jabara leads his flight of F-86Es across the frozen landscape of North Korea, their contrails writing temporary signatures against the winter sky. Intelligence reports indicate a major MiG formation assembling north of the Yalu, perhaps 40 fighters preparing for a coordinated attack on UN positions near the Chongchon River. This mission represents more than tactical opportunity. After 18 months of aerial combat over Korea, both sides understand that air superiority remains contested, its outcome dependent on daily engagements that accumulate into strategic advantage. Today's battle could determine whether MiGs retain the initiative or whether systematic F-86 tactical superiority finally translates into operational dominance. At 32,000 feet, the MiGs appear in formation, not the loose gaggle of earlier months, but a disciplined fighter regiment arranged in multiple flights with explicit tactical roles. Lead elements will engage the F-86s directly while supporting flight's position for attacks on any UN aircraft that penetrate the defensive screen. Soviet tactics have evolved to counter American innovations, creating a tactical problem that demands new solutions. Jabara studies the enemy formation and makes his decision. Instead of attacking the MiG lead elements directly, his flight will target the supporting formations, disrupting Soviet tactical coordination while creating opportunities for follow-on F-86 flights to exploit the resulting confusion. Baker Flight, this is Baker Lead. We'll take the second group, force them to react to us instead of supporting their lead elements. The tactical decision reflects months of hard-won experience. American pilots have learned that MiG formations become vulnerable when forced to react to unexpected threats, their coordination breaking down as individual pilots prioritize immediate survival over coordinated tactics. The attack develops with the precision of a choreographed dance. Jabara's flight dives toward the MiG supporting formation, their F-86s accelerating through the sound barrier as they position for high-speed attacks. The Soviet pilots, expecting to provide cover for their lead element's engagement with other F-86s, find themselves under direct attack from an unexpected angle. Major Ivan Kozadub, leading the second MiG formation, recognizes the threat and orders his flight to turn into the attacking Sabres. But the maneuver disrupts his formation support role. forcing the MiG lead elements to continue their attack without coordinated backup. The engagement spreads across the sky as individual combats develop from the tactical plan. Jabara positions behind a MiG-15 whose pilot attempts to climb away from the engagement, seeking altitude where his aircraft's performance advantages can be exploited. But the F-86 pilot has learned to read these fights differently now. Instead of following the MiG up, he maintains his dive angle, using gravity and superior high-speed handling to remain in firing position. His improved gun sight tracks the target through a series of evasive maneuvers, automatically compensating for range changes and angular rates, while Jabara concentrates on aircraft control. The MiG pilot tries every escape maneuver in his repertoire: barrel rolls, split S-dives, climbing spirals. But the F-86 remains locked in pursuit, its technological advantages finally overcoming the pilot skill gap that once favored Soviet aviators. The kill shot comes during a high-G turn that pushes both aircraft to their structural limits. Jabara's 6 machine guns fire in unison, their combined stream finding the MiG's engine bay and fuel lines. The Soviet fighter explodes in a ball of flame that illuminates the winter sky, its pilot ejecting seconds before the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. But Jabara's victory represents more than individual success. Across the engagement area, other F-86 pilots achieve similar results using systematic exploitation of technological and tactical advantages that months of combat have refined into doctrine. The paper jet that Soviet propaganda once dismissed proves capable of consistent tactical superiority when flown by pilots who understand its capabilities and limitations. The December 13th engagement produces results that reshape both sides' understanding of the air war's trajectory. 7 MiGs destroyed against 1 F-86 damaged represents more than tactical victory. It demonstrates that American pilots have achieved systematic technical and tactical advantages that promise strategic implications. Major Sutyagin, analyzing Soviet loss reports, recognizes that individual pilot skill can no longer compensate for American technological and tactical evolution. In his operational diary, he writes, "We face not just better aircraft but better systems, better training, better maintenance, better tactical integration. The Americans have learned this business faster than we anticipated." January 25, 1952. The air battle that will define the remainder of the Korean War begins with routine radio chatter as F-86 flights check in with ground control. 48 Sabres climb toward MiG Alley, their mission to sweep the area clear of enemy fighters before B-29s attack supply depots near the Yalu River. At 40,000 feet, they encounter the largest MiG formation yet assembled, nearly 100 fighters arranged in regimental strength, their pilots representing the best of Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean aviation. The engagement that follows will determine whether the systematic F-86 advantages demonstrated in previous battles can overcome numerical odds that approach 2-1. Colonel Walker Mahurin, leading the American formation, faces tactical decisions that will influence the battle's outcome. His pilots have proven they can defeat MiGs in individual combat and small formation engagements. Now they must demonstrate that superior tactics and technology can overcome massive numerical disadvantages through coordinated execution of proven techniques. All flights, this is Able-led. Standard tactics. Break up their formations and fight them in small groups. Don't let them coordinate massed attacks. The tactical approach represents the culmination of 18 months of combat evolution. F-86 flights will use aggressive attacks to disrupt MiG formations, forcing Soviet pilots into individual combats where American advantages in aircraft performance, gunnery systems, and pilot training can be systematically exploited. The engagement unfolds across 50 miles of Korean sky as the largest jet-air battle in history develops from initial contact. MiG formations attempt to coordinate attacks using numerical superiority and altitude advantage. F-86 flights counter with disciplined tactics that exploit their aircraft's technological advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. Captain Frederick Bless, flying his F-86F Jolly Roger, demonstrates the evolved American approach to jet combat. Instead of climbing to meet diving MiGs, he positions his flight for interception at 30,000 feet, where F-86 performance advantages offset MiG climbing capability. When Soviet fighters begin their attack, Bless's formation is positioned to force them into disadvantageous combat conditions. The lead MiG pilot, Major Nikolai Sutyagin, flying his final combat mission, recognizes the American trap but lacks tactical alternatives. His formation must complete its attack on the bomber formation, regardless of F-86 positioning. He signals for his flight to continue their dive, accepting engagement under conditions that favor the enemy. Bless's attack develops with the precision that characterizes evolved F-86 tactics. His flight positions for sequential attacks that deny the MiGs mutual support while exploiting every technological advantage the Sabre possesses. Improved gun sights track targets through high-G maneuvers while pilots concentrate on aircraft positioning and energy management. Sutyagin's MiG shudders under multiple hits as Bless's guns find their target. The Soviet ace, veteran of dozens of combats over Korea, recognizes that his aircraft is critically damaged and begins maneuvering toward the Chinese border. But the F-86 pilot maintains pursuit, his superior high-speed handling allowing him to match every evasive maneuver. The final moments of the engagement epitomize the transformation that has occurred in the Korean Air War. Sutyagin, perhaps the most experienced MiG pilot over Korea, flying an aircraft that once dominated UN fighters, finds himself systematically outfought by an American pilot in a machine the Soviets once dismissed as a paper jet. Bless's final burst finds the MiG's fuel lines and engine bay. The Soviet fighter explodes, taking with it not just an experienced pilot, but the psychological advantage that MiG formations once held over UN aircraft. In the space of that single combat, the balance of air superiority shifts decisively. The January 25th engagement produces results that neither side can ignore. 16 MiGs destroyed against 3 F-86s lost represents more than tactical victory. It demonstrates that systematic American advantages in technology, tactics, and training have reached the point where numerical Soviet superiority can no longer guarantee favorable outcomes. In Moscow, senior Air Force commanders review engagement reports and reach conclusions that will reshape Soviet involvement in the Korean Air War. The MiG-15 remains a capable fighter, but American pilots have learned to exploit F-86 advantages systematically while minimizing their own aircraft's weaknesses. Continued large-scale engagements promise only additional losses without corresponding tactical gains. For American pilots, the January engagement represents vindication of tactical evolution that began with the F-86's first encounters with MiGs 13 months earlier. The paper jet has proven capable not just of individual victories, but of systematic air superiority against one of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft flown by experienced pilots. Captain Jabara, now the war's leading ace with 15 confirmed victories, summarizes the transformation in his personal diary. "We started this war learning to fight jets. We're ending it having mastered the art. The MiG is still a deadly opponent, but we know how to beat it consistently now. That makes all the difference." The morning mist rises from Kimpo Air Base as Tech Sergeant Bill Maxim walks the flight line, counting empty revetments where F-86 Sabres once stood. 27 months of aerial combat over Korea have exacted their toll in machines and men, leaving gaps in formations and memories that will never fully heal. The statistics tell part of the story. 792 MiGs claimed destroyed against 78 F-86s lost in air-to-air combat, a ratio that seems to validate every claim about Sabre superiority. But statistics can't capture the human cost. The pilots who didn't return from missions over MiG Alley, the ground crews who worked through Korean winters to keep aircraft flying, the families who received telegrams beginning with the words, "Every military family fears. Lieutenant Colonel George Davis will not be coming home." The aggressive pilot who pioneered many of the tactics that gave F-86s their advantage over MiGs died on February 10, 1952, when his Sabre was shot down during a mission over the Yalu River. His 14 confirmed victories made him one of the war's leading aces. But more importantly, his tactical innovations saved countless other pilots who learned to fight MiGs using techniques he developed. Captain James Lowe, the pilot who survived the massive November 30th air battle, writes to his wife from a hospital bed in Tokyo, where he recovers from injuries sustained during ejection from his battle-damaged F-86. "The machine brought me through fights I never should have survived," he tells her. "But it couldn't protect me from my own mistakes." The physical injuries will heal, but the psychological scars run deeper. Lowe, like many fighter pilots, struggles with what medical officers are beginning to understand as combat stress reaction. The accumulated weight of months spent in aerial combat where survival depends on split-second decisions and mechanical reliability. Some pilots complete their tours and return to normal lives. Others find themselves unable to adapt to peacetime routines after experiencing the hyper-awareness that jet combat demands. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American mechanic who maintained F-86 engines throughout the war, reflects on the technological lessons learned through combat. "We started with aircraft that required constant attention just to keep them flying. By the end, we had machines that were reliable enough for pilots to concentrate on fighting instead of worrying about mechanical failure." The maintenance evolution paralleled tactical development. Early F-86As required extensive ground support and careful handling of temperamental systems. By 1953, improved models incorporated thousands of minor modifications identified through combat operations. Stronger components, more reliable systems, and improved maintainability that kept more aircraft mission-ready. But the cost of that evolution can't be measured in statistics alone. Chen's maintenance logs record the human price of mechanical failure. Engines that failed during combat, hydraulic systems that quit at critical moments, electrical problems that left pilots without essential instruments during engagements with enemy fighters. Each failure taught lessons that improved subsequent aircraft, but the education came at the expense of pilots and aircraft lost to preventable causes. In Moscow, Colonel General Pavel Jigarev reviews intelligence summaries that paint an uncomfortable picture of Soviet Air Force performance over Korea. Official reports claim favorable kill ratios and successful completion of air defense missions, but classified analyses reveal systematic tactical defeats that allowed UN air forces to achieve operational superiority over North Korea. The propaganda apparatus that once mocked the F-86 as a paper jet now struggles to explain why MiG-15 formations can no longer prevent UN air attacks on North Korean targets. Soviet media emphasizes individual victories while downplaying the overall trajectory of the air war. But internal reports acknowledge that American pilots have achieved systematic advantages that neutralize many MiG-15 performance benefits. "The Americans have learned this business faster than anticipated," Jigarev writes in a classified assessment sent to the Politburo. "Their pilots demonstrate superior training, their aircraft incorporate technological advantages we underestimated, and their tactics exploit our weaknesses while minimizing their own vulnerabilities." The admission carries political implications that extend beyond military assessments. Soviet involvement in Korea was predicated partly on demonstrating technological superiority over Western aircraft and tactics. The systematic defeat of MiG formations by F-86 pilots suggests that American industrial and training capabilities exceed Soviet estimates, with implications for broader Cold War competition. In Washington, Pentagon officials draw their own lessons from Korean air combat. The F-86's success validates investment in advanced fire control systems, superior pilot training, and technological integration that maximizes individual aircraft capabilities. But they also recognize that numerical superiority remains important. Even the best pilots flying the most advanced aircraft can be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers of competent opponents. Secretary of the Air Force Thomas Finletter summarizes the strategic implications in a classified memorandum. Korean air operations demonstrate that technological superiority, properly exploited through superior tactics and training, can overcome numerical disadvantages. However, we must not assume that future opponents will repeat Soviet tactical errors or that technological advantages alone guarantee victory. The bureaucratic language disguises profound implications for future Air Force development. Korean combat validates the American approach to fighter design. sophisticated aircraft flown by highly trained pilots using advanced systems to maximize individual effectiveness. But it also reveals the importance of pilot quality, suggesting that future conflicts will be won by air forces that can combine technological advantages with superior human performance. The Korean Air War's lessons reshape military aviation doctrine worldwide as air forces analyze combat reports and adapt their own training and equipment programs. The systematic F-86 victory over MiG-15s demonstrates principles that will influence fighter development for decades. The importance of pilot workload reduction through automated systems, the value of superior gunnery systems in high-speed engagements, and the decisive advantage of comprehensive pilot training programs. Major Frederick Bless, credited with 10 aerial victories, becomes an instructor at the Air Force's Fighter Weapons School, where he develops training programs based on Korean combat experience. His courses emphasize energy management, tactical teamwork, and systematic exploitation of aircraft performance advantages. Lessons learned through actual combat against competent opponents flying advanced aircraft. Korean air combat taught us that individual pilot skill matters, but systematic tactical superiority matters more, Bless explains to his students. The MiG-15 was never an inferior aircraft. Soviet pilots were never incompetent opponents. We won because we learned to fight smarter, not just harder. The training revolution extends beyond tactics to encompass maintenance, logistics, and operational planning. Korean experience demonstrates that sustainable air operations require integrated systems that can maintain high sortie rates while preserving pilot and aircraft effectiveness. Future air forces must balance technological advancement with operational sustainability. Lessons that inform Cold War military planning. International observers draw their own conclusions from Korean air combat reports. British, French, and other NATO air forces modify their training programs to incorporate American tactical innovations while adapting them to their own aircraft and operational requirements. The Royal Air Force's Fighter Command implements energy management training based on Korean lessons, while the French Armée de l'Air redesigns its pilot training programs to emphasize systematic tactical exploitation of aircraft capabilities. Even neutral nations study Korean air combat for insights into modern aerial warfare. Swedish and Swiss air forces, operating indigenous fighter aircraft, analyze engagement reports to identify tactical principles that transcend specific aircraft types. The systematic nature of F-86 tactical superiority suggests that proper training and tactics can maximize any fighter's effectiveness against more numerous opponents. As the Korean War ends, the narrative of F-86 Sabre superiority begins its transformation from combat report to military legend. The paper jet that Soviet propaganda once dismissed becomes the symbol of American technological and tactical excellence, its victory over the MiG-15 serving as proof that democratic societies can produce superior military systems. Popular accounts emphasize the dramatic aspects of jet combat: supersonic speeds, high-altitude dogfights, and the courage of individual pilots facing overwhelming odds. Magazine articles and early television programs celebrate F-86 aces like James Jabara and Joseph McConnell, transforming their combat achievements into symbols of American technological superiority during the early Cold War period. But the myth simplifies complex realities. Korean air combat involved thousands of pilots, ground crew members, and support personnel whose contributions enabled F-86 success. Technological advantages mattered, but they required systematic exploitation through superior tactics, training, and maintenance to produce decisive results. Individual heroism played a role, but organizational excellence proved more important than personal courage. Colonel Harrison Thing, who commanded F-86 operations during critical phases of the Korean Air War, attempts to preserve accurate historical understanding in his post-war writings. The Sabre was a superior fighter aircraft, but its success depended on systematic advantages that extended far beyond the aircraft itself, he writes. We won because we learned to integrate technology, tactics, and training more effectively than our opponents. The nuanced assessment struggles to compete with simpler narratives that emphasize dramatic individual achievements and clear technological superiority. As Korean War memory fades into history, the F-86's victory over the MiG-15 becomes a symbol of American technological dominance rather than a case study in systematic military excellence. Aviation historians later attempt to separate myth from reality, analyzing classified combat reports and pilot interviews to reconstruct accurate accounts of Korean air operations. Their research reveals that F-86 advantages were real but required systematic exploitation to produce tactical superiority. The aircraft's success vindicated American approaches to fighter design and pilot training, but it also demonstrated the importance of institutional learning and tactical adaptation. The Korean Air War's influence extends far beyond the specific aircraft and tactics employed over MiG-Alley. Its lessons inform Cold War military competition as both superpowers develop new fighter aircraft and training programs based on Korean combat experience. The systematic nature of F-86 superiority suggests principles that transcend specific technological capabilities. American defense contractors study Korean combat reports to identify design features that contributed to F-86 success. The aircraft's superior high-speed handling, advanced fire control system, and pilot-friendly cockpit layout become templates for future fighter development. The Century Series fighters, F-100, F-101, F-102, F-104, F-105, and F-106, incorporate lessons learned from Korean air combat. Soviet aircraft designers draw different conclusions from the same combat reports. The MiG-15's defeat suggests that raw performance advantages insufficient when opponents possess superior systems integration and pilot training. Future Soviet fighters emphasize not just speed and climb rate, but also pilot workload reduction and weapons system effectiveness. The broader implications extend to military aviation doctrine worldwide. Korean air combat demonstrates that modern aerial warfare requires integrated systems combining advanced aircraft, sophisticated weapons, comprehensive training, and systematic tactical development. Individual pilot skill remains important, but organizational excellence determines ultimate success. NATO air forces adapt Korean lessons to their own operational requirements, developing training programs that emphasize energy management, tactical teamwork, and systematic exploitation of aircraft capabilities. The Warsaw Pact responds with its own doctrinal modifications, creating tactical approaches designed to counter Western technological advantages through numerical superiority and coordinated attacks. As both sides develop increasingly sophisticated aircraft and weapon systems, the Korean precedent suggests that technological advantages alone will not guarantee victory. Success will depend on systematic integration of technology, tactics, training, and operational sustainability, lessons written in the contrails above MiG-Alley. The sun sets over Kimpo Air Base as the last F-86 Sabre taxis toward the hangar, its mission complete. In the distance, contrails dissipate against the Korean sky, temporary marks that will fade within minutes, leaving no permanent trace of the aerial battles that once raged in this airspace. 50 years later, aviation historians still debate the precise kill ratios achieved by F-86 pilots over Korea. Some records were lost, others inflated by combat's confusion, and many victories claimed by multiple pilots who fired at the same target. But the statistical arguments miss the larger truth. In the skies over Korea, the jet age was born through combat between pilots who transformed aerial warfare through their courage, skill, and systematic learning. The Soviet Union never again committed its most advanced fighters and experienced pilots to direct confrontation with American air power. The MiG-15 remained a formidable aircraft, but Korean experience demonstrated that technological capability alone could not overcome systematic American advantages in training, tactics, and operational integration. Captain James Jabara, the first American jet ace, returned from Korea to a hero's welcome and a peacetime career that never quite matched the intensity of combat over MiG-Alley. In his later years, he reflected on the transformation that occurred during those 27 months when jet fighters wrote the future of aerial warfare in contrails and cannon fire. We learned that wars are won by systems, not just machines," he said during a 1970s interview. The Sabre was a good fighter, but we made it great through the way we flew it, maintained it, and integrated it into our operations. That's what the Soviets never understood about American air power. The paper jet that once drew Soviet mockery became the foundation for American air superiority that lasted through the Cold War and beyond. But its victory represented more than technological triumph. It demonstrated that democratic societies could produce military systems capable of systematic excellence when challenged by competent opponents. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson written in the skies over Korea. Technology matters, but human systems matter more. The F-86 Sabre dominated MiGs not because it was infinitely superior, but because American pilots, ground crews, and commanders learned to exploit its advantages while compensating for its limitations. They transformed a good aircraft into a great weapon system through systematic excellence that their opponents could not match. Today, as modern fighter aircraft streak across distant skies, they carry forward lessons learned over MiG Alley more than 7 decades ago. The specific aircraft have changed, but the fundamental truth remains. Aerial warfare belongs to those who can integrate technology, training, and tactics into systems that maximize human and mechanical potential. The contrails fade, but the lessons endure.